can take their masters to court, so they leave legal records behind. There is a particularly horrible case of one indentured servant called John Thomas, who is hung from his wrists with lit matches between his fingers, causing him to lose a lot of mobility in his hands. Such an abuse is so rare and shocking that Thomas is able to take his master to court and get him locked up. Thomas is freed, his medical expenses are paid, and he is given compensation for his injury. Enslaved people are legally property and cannot take their masters to court. A slave owner can legally kill an enslaved person in any way he sees fit, and some resort to the worst tortures you can think of in order to make an example of rebels. What happens to the Irish is horrible, absolutely, but it is a different thing to slavery. There is no need to exaggerate the horrors perpetuated on the Irish people. And if we're talking about the Irish relationship to the slave trade, it shouldn't be forgotten that, of course, there are Irish slavers too, like the slave ship captain David Toohey or slave owner Bishop Patrick Lynch. So where does this idea come from? Sadly, it's come from white nationalists. They love the idea that my ancestors were slaves too, and you don't hear me complaining. If these blacks can't make it in life, they must just be lazy. Shut the f*** up with your cries and racial I'm Irish, we were slaves before you, and for longer, you lazy ignorant humans. Do you hear us cry? Do we kill cops? No, we could bitch. Is the IRA here killing cops? No! They want you to think that slavery wasn't that bad, or it wasn't about race. It's also a very recent myth. The Irish historian Liam Hogan has done great work on unpicking this myth in minute detail, and he traces it back to a book written in 1993 by Michael A. Hoffman. Just so you know what kind of guy Hoffman is, he's been flagged by the Anti-Defamation League for his Holocaust denial and anti-Semitism, and for claiming, among other things, that if Judaism ever becomes supreme in the United States, there will be a mass murder of non-Jews. So, not the guy you should be taking history lessons from, basically. And I am suddenly seeing this myth that was only invented in the last 30 years being repeated by my visitors as if it's a fact they've known all their lives. It worries me that this idea that started with Holocaust deniers and neo-Nazis has found its way down to Brenda and Alfred going for a lovely day out at the museum. Like, I'm not saying you're a horrendous racist if you thought the Irish slave myth was true, but please take a second look at the person who told it to you, and don't trust them again. Didn't the Africans enslave their own people? Africans do enslave other Africans, yes. Many of the African societies Europeans find are already deeply enmeshed in slavery. Typically, people who are sold into slavery are criminals and prisoners of war. If you commit certain crimes, you can be enslaved as a legal punishment. But at the height of the trade, gangs of slavers burn down villages and kidnap anyone they can. Most people are enslaved violently. Africans are captured by other Africans and traded for goods like fabric or guns. Some West African states, like Dahomey, the Oyo Empire and the Kong Empire, grow very rich off the slave trade. But unlike the European countries that get rich, the Kong Empire doesn't exist today. Europeans didn't invent African slavery, but they are responsible for its massive growth, and they start the practice of forcibly uprooting people thousands of miles from home. I want to be careful here and stress that the intra-African form of slavery is not some enlightened, peaceful kind with happy slaves and kind masters. It also involves ripping people from their homes, breaking up families, physical violence and unpaid labour. However, there is a particular flavour to the form of European slavery that distinguishes it from intra-African slavery. Most obviously, the European form involves the Middle Passage, the journey from Africa to the Americas. This involves being herded by people who don't speak your language into the lower deck of a ship, with no more space than a man in his coffin. No windows, no light, and no facilities except a tub in the middle of the floor, for at least 6 weeks. It is violent and terrifying, and the Middle Passage alone kills about 10% of the people who are forced to make it. It's hard to be sure about these finer distinctions in the historical record, but it seems like inherited slavery also isn't present in African societies before the arrival of Europeans. You might be enslaved, but your child isn't necessarily. On a Caribbean plantation, if you have a child, then that child doesn't belong to you. They belong to the slave owner, and they can be sold away or even killed for any reason with no repercussions. African slavery is also, obviously, not tied to skin colour. You aren't marked out as only fit for slavery by the colour of your skin, so it's easier for formerly enslaved people to reintegrate into society once they become free. Transatlantic slavery also has a completely different impact on the world we live in than African slavery. Although African slavers may have benefited in the short term, in Europe the institutions that plantation money bought are still going strong today, whereas the African kingdoms that sold people into slavery are not. Whereas the trade strips wealth out of Africa, you can't deny Europe has done pretty well out of the slave trade. So if you're asking the question in good faith, that's the answer. But it would be wrong of me to pretend that everyone who asks about intra-African slavery asks because they're genuinely interested. It's always, what if the real racists are black? And it just smacks of trying to spread the blame and change the subject. Like, take the log out of your own country's eye first, people. Why can't we just let this be past? Why do you have to keep bringing up old history? Why are we even talking about this? Well, first off, this is a history channel. You came to me, not the other way around, buddy. I have genuinely had people in the middle of a historical museum ask me, why do you want to bring up old history? But also, the transatlantic trade has a massive impact on the world we live in today. There are ports that wouldn't exist, cities that would have stayed villages. In Africa, systematically having the fittest young members of society constantly kidnapped and taken to other countries